You are listening to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review. My name is Ryan Evans. In this episode of Horns, we have Josh Shifrinson, an assistant professor of international relations at the Carty School of Global Studies at Boston University, and he joins the UT crowd to talk about his new book, Rising Titans, Falling Giants, How Great Powers Exploit Power Shifts.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Josh was certain to bring us Boston weather for today, as you can tell. I want to thank all the sponsors of this event today, the Clements Center for National Security and the Strauss Center for International Security and Law, and also the John Quincy Adams Society, which is a national organization devoted to bringing new perspectives on international relations, particularly perspectives that emphasize, I think, the limits of American force. And so they were nice enough, the John Quincy Adams Society, to help co-sponsor this with our excellent centers that we have here on campus. And it's a real pleasure to introduce a friend to many of us and a colleague of a long time, Josh Shifrinson. Josh has made quite a name for himself in many ways early on in his career. He's published some of the most important work on NATO expansion, looking at the different compromises and diplomatic agreements that accompanied NATO expansion. And Josh has tried to explain to us the inexplicable, which is Vladimir Putin's behavior with regard to NATO expansion. Josh taught for many years at Texas A&M University. I guess it's a university, right?
I think that's right.
Yeah. And
used to be a technical college, is my understanding.
right. And he is now a professor ensconced at Boston University, teaching international relations, public policy, and starting his own center there. And it's great to hear about that. And I am super excited to talk about a little bit his book that he's going to talk about in much more detail, of course. It has a lovely bright cover, as everyone can see, Falling Giants, Rising Titans. I've read this book in two forms now, and as a dissertation and as a book manuscript, and I'm sure Josh will be happy to answer questions from some of you graduate students how you turn a dissertation into a book manuscript. But I just want to say two things about this. First of all, it is a very rigorous history of the rise and fall of great powers, which is a topic near and dear to my heart and Will's as well. And it's also a very theoretically innovative way of thinking about realism in the context of power dynamics and power shifts. And power dynamics and power shifts are issues that realism often has trouble with because it's a pretty static view of the world. And Josh, I think, has done some really innovative work in getting us to think about realism in context for historical change, and bringing history and realist theory together. And so without further ado, Josh, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you for being here.
Please. Thank you, Jeremy, for that really wonderful introduction. I'm kind of inclined to say the talk's over. You all can leave now because I can't really beat that. But thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Will, for having me in. And thank you to the John Quincy Adams Society for having me in as well. If this were at A&M, I'd begin by saying howdy. But insofar as I think that would get me pelted around here, I'll just begin by saying thank you for having me in and thank you all for coming out. This is a cover of my book. It's entitled Rising Titans, Falling Giants, How Great Powers Exploit Power Shifts. And again, I'm Josh Shifrinson. And before I launch into the theory of the book, I just want to begin with kind of the policy puzzle that I'm trying to get at here, which is, when we think about the end of the Cold War, we can think about this in a couple of ways, but when we think about the end of the Cold War, we have this question of what should the United States do when it sees the Soviet Union begin to fall apart, right? Well, if you think states always seek security, then this would be an opportunity to declare victory in the Cold War and pull the troops out. If you think that democracy and liberalism help ameliorate competition between great powers, and this would be an opportunity to spread liberalism or spread also economic interdependence with the Soviet Union and try to build bridges to create a more cooperative Europe. But in fact, the United States did none of these things. Over the course of the Soviet Union's decline, over the course of 1983 to 1991, as Europe goes from a world where there are two superpower blocs to a world that looks like this, where there's no more Soviet Union, we see American policy go through three distinct phases. In the first phase, lasting from the early Reagan administration through the start of the H.W. Bush administration, we see American foreign policy emphasizing slow and steady change in Europe. only for at the start of 1990, when the debate over German reunification, the fundamental change in Cold War Europe occurs, American policy turns on a dime and begins to try to exploit the Soviet decline. And yet, faced in 1991 with the possible collapse of the Soviet Union, American policy backtracks yet again and again emphasizes slow and steady change. And my question, one of the motivating puzzles of my project, is why? In fact, we can think about this more generally. I ask in my project, when a great power declines, like the Soviet Union, what do other relatively rising states do? And when and why do they pursue predatory strategies designed to push declining states down or from the great power ranks, versus at other times embrace more cooperative, supportive strategies, keeping a declining state among the great powers? And I want to understand not just change in the type, but also change in degree, becoming more or less predatory or supportive. Unless we think these are just kind of anodyne theoretical questions, we all know that these are fundamental issues of public policy today. At the start of the 21st century, there are real worries that a rising China will challenge a relatively declining United States, be it by changing the territorial status quo in East Asia, picking off American allies, perhaps pursuing global hegemony. And accompanying all this are concerns that war may be in the offing between a rising China and a declining United States. And to give you a preview of what I argue in the book to help gain traction in this theoretical, historical, and policy question, I argue that relatively rising states often do seek to expand, but they try to do so without endangering the power and security they currently enjoy. They're cautious. And this means that the more a declining state can help a rising state offset other great powers as an ally, the more likely we are to see rising states counterintuitively pursue supportive strategies, cooperate with the declining state. Whereas the more a declining state is only going to be a threat to that rising state, the more likely we are to see rising state predation. And what I'm going to talk about later on is how the choice of and change in rising state predation or support hinges on the declining state's strategic value to the rising state, how useful it is as an ally, and the declining state's own military posture, its ability to impose military costs upon a rising state. And I'm going to come back to this. So what am I going to do? How am I going to get through this? Well, having given you the question, its importance in the preview, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the concepts, because there are grad students who care about theory in this room. I'll then talk a little bit about research design, how I studied this topic. I'll turn my attention to walking through one of the seminal cases in the book, that of the American rise and the Soviet Union's decline, how the United States managed that process, and then backtrack out to talk about its policy and theoretical and historiographic implications. So let me just clarify at the outset that when I say rise and decline, I'm talking about relative power. By rising state, I simply mean a state that's growing in relative terms, and by declining state, I mean a state that's declining in relative terms. So while we often think of decline as the fall of the Roman Empire and the Huns coming over the walls of Rome, pulling down the statues and burning the city, that's not necessarily the only case of decline. We're talking about relative change in power.
They were the Goths.
I study American foreign policy. History began in 1776, so that's how it goes. So what this all means is that rise and decline occur whenever one state grows stronger or one state grows weaker. This is a relative assessment. All right. So I focus in this project on the strategies of relatively rising states. And by strategy, I mean a political, military, ends-means chain, an integrated approach towards other states, which means that varies along two different dimensions. We talk about rising state goals, where I talk about predatory or supportive goals. So predatory goals are where you try to weaken a declining state. Supportive goals are where you try to preserve a declining state as a great power. And as well as variation in terms of the means used. And here, this is a complex topic. But broadly speaking, we can think about rising states using two different kinds of means. Limited means, where they try to incur slow and gradual changes to affect a decliner's position as a great power. And more intense means, where they try to incur rapid and substantial changes in a declining state's position as a great power, either stronger or weaker, just affecting it in an intense way. When you put this together, we can think about rising state strategies as varying in four kind of conceptually distinct ways. On the one hand, When rising states pursue a predatory goal using intense means, this is the classic concern of declining states, right? Where a rising state goes for the jugular, pushes them out of the great power ranks, and they're all done. I refer to this as pursuing a relegation strategy, using means such as going to war, picking off allies, maybe engaging in diplomatic isolation, nasty and brutish behaviors. On the other hand, when states are still predatory, but they're engaging in more limited efforts to do so, I refer to these as weakening strategies. These are things like arms racing, trying to affect the balance of power over time, engage in economic sanctions, maybe some diplomatic needling. These are steps that make a declining state's life harder, but don't immediately change its position as a great power, right? Moving to the other side of the table, when you have supportive goals using limited means, I call these bolstering strategies. Strategies designed to keep a declining state as a great power, but at limited cost, risk, and expense to a rising state through efforts such as token diplomatic support, occasional economic assistance, and things of that sort. And finally, the most advantageous position for a declining state, or rising states pursue strengthening strategies. Strategies designed to keep a declining state as a great power with a supportive end, using intense means through steps such as offering diplomatic guarantees, perhaps alliance offers, large-scale economic assistance. Think of the Marshall Plan, large economic transfers to keep a declining state around, okay? So conceptually, we have 4 different types of rising state strategies. And there's squishiness, there's variation among them, but we can talk about it as distinct boxes. Now, what's interesting is that when people have studied rising state strategy before, they actually really haven't done so. And it's not praise to myself, it's just this is a missing lacuna of research, right? There isn't a lot of thinking about this. Now, we hear arguments based on security dilemma concerns, notions that rising states and declining states that can reassure one another are more likely to cooperate. We hear arguments that when states are economically interdependent, rising states are more likely to pursue one of those supportive strategies. Likewise, we hear notions that the more similar ideal states are ideologically, the more likely they are to pursue cooperative supportive strategies. And likewise, we hear concerns that when rising states are led by particularly aggressive leaders, we're likely to see predatory strategies. But these are kind of ad hoc, kind of one off-the-cuff concepts that above all don't explain variation in the type and degree of rising state strategy. And this is where I try to fill the gap. This is where my argument comes in. In the book, which very pretty cover right here to reemphasize the point, I develop what I call predation theory, creatively enough, where I argue very simply that rising states seek power, but they do so within limits. They seek low-cost opportunities to grow, to expand, but at the same time without endangering their own power and security. This means that they want to share, above all, the costs of confronting other security threats, get other states to bear the burden of confronting other great powers and create opportunities for their own future expansion. This means, in turn, that they want to avoid war along the way, along the course of their rise. They want to avoid fostering a counterbalancing coalition, a hostile coalition designed to oppose them. And they also want to preserve allies that may be useful against other states in the system. Right? So these 3 generic concerns, which means in turn that that the choice of and change in a rising state strategy is going to depend on the declining state's strategic value, which I'll talk about in half a second, and the declining state's military posture. Let me unpack this just a wee bit. So by strategic value, I mean whether a declining state can help a rising state confront other great power threats. Right? It's how attractive or able to be an ally is it? And this is a composite of 4 kind of subcomponents. The first is whether there are other great powers around, right? If a state is going to be of use against other great powers, there have to be other great powers around. Second is whether a declining state is geographically located in a useful area, right? If you're trying to confront Nazi Germany and you're located in the Pacific Ocean, that's not very useful. Likewise, you talk about the decliner's latent potential, whether if a rising state comes to its assistance, the declining state can be, use a tendentious phrase, can be made great again, right? In the sense of a rising state that looks at a declining state that seems to be falling apart at the seams, if it doesn't have the latent potential to be made great again, it's just throwing good money after bad. And finally, you ask the question whether there seems to be some domestic basis for support in the declining state. If a rising state offers the olive branch, is there someone in the declining state who wants to reciprocate? Now, if the answer is yes to all these four things, then I argue that a declining state offers high strategic value to a rising state, which encourages the rising state to pursue one of those supportive strategies I mentioned earlier. Conversely, if those conditions aren't met, then a declining state offers low strategic value, pushing one of those predatory strategies. Okay, so we have supportive or predatory strategies, but what about variation to degree, right? Bolstering versus weakening, support, and so on and so forth. Well, this is where the declining state's military posture comes into play. There are lots of different ways to talk about military power, right? This is a perennial topic. I know some of you just read Clausewitz this week. This topic never goes away. But for my purposes, by military posture, I mean whether a declining state can deploy military assets to defend its interest if a rising state chooses to issue a challenge, right? It's a simple question of, if I push, can I get punched in the face? Very simple question. I'm from New Jersey. This is how we think about things. Now, when we talk about military posture, we can talk about it a couple different ways. For my purposes, I talk about military postures as being robust, where, yes, a declining state can punch a rising state in the face and it hurts, or a situation where military postures are pretty weak, where a declining state lacks military tools to impose costs upon a rising state. And when we cross-pollinate these, well, the important thing to realize is that these variables, the military posture variable, has different consequences depending upon the declining state's strategic value. Let me build this out. When a declining state has low strategic value and can't defend itself, this is when we're going to see those relegation strategies, those really nasty, aggressive strategies by rising state I noted earlier. This is a situation where a rising state seeking to push a declining state from the great power ranks can do so without any concerns that the declining state can push back in any meaningful way. On the other hand, when a declining state has low strategic value but has a robust military posture, this is where a rising state that might seek to continue growing is going to hang back and kind of push for gradualist change. Don't topple the apple cart quite yet. Try to incur slow changes that harm the declining state, but don't incur the risk of war. Kind of operate below a magical threshold believed to cause war. On the other side of the equation, when a declining state has high strategic value and the declining state has a weak military posture, this is actually, paradoxically, the best possible situation for a declining state. This is a situation where a rising state, seeing a useful ally begin to fall apart at the seams, begins to open the taproots, right? Open the well springs, offer as much support as possible, out of concern that failure to do so will lead to the declining state's attack, or an attack on the rising state by other great powers, or its collapse entirely. Finally, when a declining state has high strategic value but a robust military posture, this is where rising states, even if they want to help a declining state out, hang back a little bit, right? Because after all, if a declining state has a robust military posture, then not only may that declining state turn around and attack me in the future, but it can also entrap me in conflict with other parties. And if it looks able to provide security for itself, I have no incentive to aid it. So combined, variation in military and strategic value and military posture can help predict these four different strategies. Okay? So how do I study this? Let me say a few words about research design. I'm happy to talk about this later. In the book, I use a lot of history, right? I'm a failed historian. I had an undergraduate professor who, almost certainly to insult me, told me I had a great mind, but I wrote like a political scientist, which I think was almost certainly an insult. But here we are these days. In the book, I study the American and Soviet response to Great Britain's decline after World War II. Arguably one of the seminal changes taking the world from a multipolar world to the bipolar Cold War order. And then I studied the American response to the Soviet Union's decline in the late Cold War, a moment that took the Cold War order from bipolar competition to the United States' unipolar moment, unipolar era, a relative rise unseen in other points of world history. And then accompanying that, I also studied the British, German, and Russian responses to the declines of Austria-Hungary and France in the late 19th and early 20th century, right? Austria-Hungary and France being the two great, I apologize for anyone who's from France or Austria here, the two great losers in the 19th century balance of power game. And so I studied how the other great powers dealt with that process. This gives me 9 total case studies, and I'd be happy to speak at any of these cases in Q&A. I emphasize process tracing, the comparative case method. This is a political science jargon that I will not belabor. But along the way, I try to evaluate speech evidence. I try to evaluate causal processes. I try to evaluate sequences of events, and look at moments when policies began to change to see if they matched with the kind of overall predictions of my argument. To do this, I collected a lot of documents. This is a picture of grad student me in the Reagan Library, so please don't disseminate this photo ever. I had over 7,000 documents collected from a bevy of American and British archives. And to supplement it, I also conducted almost 60 interviews with many of the American policymakers involved in managing the Soviet Union's decline in the late Cold War. To give you a sense of what this looked like, this is the H.W. Bush foreign policy apparatus circa 1990. And these figures in red are those I was able to interview. So about 50% of the senior decision makers involved. And you'll notice I circled James Baker, Secretary of State Jim Baker. That's because I was unable to interview Secretary of State Baker, but I was, I think, the 4th scholar given access to his personal papers at Princeton University. So I was able to get some pretty good granularity on what American policymakers were thinking about and evaluating as the Soviet Union began to decline. So let me talk about that a little bit. Let me talk a little bit about American foreign policy and the Soviet Union's decline. It's kind of a test ground for my theory, but also to show some of the empirics in my volume. Again, I'm going to try to explain American foreign policy as the world goes from a situation like this, where Europe is divided into a Cold War locked-in order. There's this state called the Soviet Union, with its allies in the Warsaw Pact threatening the NATO allies, with the U.S. right around over here. And that's not a plug for the Clements Center intentionally. And we're going to explain how the world about how American policy evolves as the world goes to this, a situation where there is no more Soviet Union, right? To quote Monty Python, this parrot is no more. The Warsaw Pact is defunct, and NATO has begun marching eastward. Now, what's interesting is that other arguments actually predict lots of American cooperation with the Soviet Union in this period. Whereas my argument uniquely predicts that the US should prey upon the Soviet Union because this is a case where the Soviet Union offered low strategic value. The USSR was the only competitor to the US in the Cold War, and therefore an impediment to American dominance, American hegemony, unipolarity, whatever term you care to use, the Soviet Union was in the way. As a result, we expect the United States to try to prey upon the Soviet Union, with the intensity of that predation waxing and waning as Soviet military posture vacillates, as it oscillates. And that's exactly what we find. To give you a preview of what I'll say in just a moment, I'm going to argue that American policy went through 3 phases. Again, phase 1 of weakening in the early 80s into the late 1980s as the US tried to push the Soviet Union gently to the brink. A period of relegation in 1990 when faced with the collapse of East Germany, the US rapidly pursued German reunification within NATO over Soviet opposition and pulled the unified state out of the Warsaw Pact, helping to kill the Warsaw Pact. Only for this policy to change again in 1991 when faced with the possible collapse of the Soviet state, American policy again walks back to pursue this cautious weakening strategy. Let me build this out a little bit. So as I mentioned, the US pursued a weakening strategy in 1983 through 1989. This is actually a policy that's consistent across the Reagan and H.W. Bush administrations at the outset. We see American policymakers discussing early on how, quote unquote, the Soviet Union is in deep trouble. And in response, the US begins to push asymmetric bargains upon the USSR, particularly in arms control, but other areas as well. Third world conflicts loom large. And the US continues to arms race the Soviet Union in doing so, trying to gain some military advantages along the way. You don't need to take my word for it. This is an archival document written by Colin Powell, who is the National Security Advisor, in December of 1987, who says Gorbachev, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, is playing for the longer haul for 1988 and beyond. Our task is to extract a solid price in terms of stabilizing and verifiable arms reductions, protection of the Strategic Defense Initiative, and an end to Soviet foreign aggression and human rights abuses. In other words, the United States is aware that it has a window of opportunity to push the Soviets where and how we can. Indeed, this even continues when we begin to see Eastern Europe rise from revolting into the Soviet Union. As this process kicks forward, the U.S. pursues a gradualist course, going so far as to try to convince solidarity and liberalizers in the Eastern Bloc to support communist officials in power. Now that's a fascinating development. We always think of solidarity as the American ally in Eastern Europe, but here is the U.S. discussing how to keep communist officials in power, at least for the short term. In doing so, the U.S. tries to coordinate to soft pedal issues with the Soviet Union, and then after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the U.S. the initial American response is to try to soft pedal German reunification. So why is this? Well, consistent with my argument, this is a period where the Soviet Union offered low strategic value. We see American policymakers talking about bringing about American ascendancy. This is Secretary of State George Shultz, a moderate in the Reagan administration of all things, discussing how we could bring about real change in Moscow's approach to the world and make it more conducive to American interests. And the idea is that the U.S. could improve its security by rolling back the Soviet presence in Eastern Europe and much of the rest of the world. As James Baker put it in 1989, the point of American policy was to take advantage of the situation to reduce the options available to future Soviet leaders. Well, but this is also a moment in time, though, so we see the predation, but the caution comes from the robust Soviet military posture. The Soviet Union, after all, had over 600,000 troops in Eastern Europe, a robust nuclear arsenal. The consequences loomed dire. Indeed, American policymakers were concerned or uncertain how far the Soviet Union could be pushed, with Secretary of State Shultz remarking how the American goal was to keep the Russians behind us, but not so far that they become dangerous. The Soviets, as Brent Scowcroft, the National Security Advisor to Bush, told me in an interview, could always stop or arrest changes in the area. And there are real worries of a crisis and perhaps even nuclear escalation. Indeed, we see policy members discussing this explicitly, remarking how the instrument of last resort is still available to the Soviet Union. And there are no guarantees that the Soviet Empire will go quietly into the night, a Dylan Thomas reference. In all the war games over the years, the most convincing scenario for a European Central Front war has been a Soviet military act of desperation. Real concerns were alive and well, even beneath a facade of fair stability. Yet this policy changes on a dime in 1990, where the U.S. pursues a relegation strategy. This is a moment in time where after Eastern Germany has risen in revolt following the fall of the Berlin Wall, the U.S. takes East Germany, helps reunify it with West Germany, pulls that state out of the Warsaw Pact, sticks it in NATO in a move that the State Department itself says would tear the lodestone out of the Soviet Empire. Indeed, we see American policymakers in 1990 discussing how Germany in NATO was the best possible American scenario, a goal that American policymakers did not think they could get at the start of the year. Yet by the end of the year, that's exactly what had happened. What changed? Well, the U.S. is still focused on predation, where policymakers are discussing how this is a rare period in which we can seek to achieve a fundamental shift in the strategic balance. That's consistent. But unlike prior periods, this is a moment in time where the Soviet military posture is incredibly weak, at least in Eastern Europe, where the 1989 revolutions undercut the Soviet military position and the Soviets seemed unable to use force. Don't take my word for it. Trust but verify, to quote Ronald Reagan, right? We actually see policymakers using these terms. Condoleezza Rice, who was then the senior national security official for the Soviet Union, writes in early 1990 that I believe the Soviets would not even threaten the Germans if the U.S. pushed on German reunification in NATO. Within a week, even this was out of date. Bob Blackwell and Robert Hutchings, Bob Hutchings is in this building, I believe, somewhere, actually write that we could remind Gorbachev that his troops are fast being pushed out of the region if the Soviets dared object to American ambitions. Until finally, on 1 February 1990, Condi Rice, in a different memo, writes that the Soviets are unable to re-extend their tentacles into Eastern Europe, a moment for the U.S. to push as much as it wanted. Well, you might think that this policy would just continue even when the Soviet Union begins to decline, begins to fall apart. Yet, in fact, in 1991, we see American policymakers walk it back yet again. We see a debate at this point in time between what's called the Soviet center, Moscow, and the republics, kind of the constituent republics of the Soviet Union. And the U.S. surprisingly sides with a weak center, trying to slow roll the Soviet collapse. The American goal is to use economic and military initiatives to devolve power, but not bring about a fast collapse of the Soviet state. The goal as Jim Baker put it, was a peaceful landing. So why is this? Well, again, predation continues. The Soviet Union still has low strategic value, where as someone else puts it, a real reform program would turn the Soviet Union into a third-rate military power, which is what we want. So this is not a happy American story. But this is also a moment in time when it comes to protecting the Soviet Union itself. The Soviet military position is quite robust. It has a very large nuclear arsenal and a lot of internal security forces. And this scares the United States. This worries the United States. And this, not only does the nuclear issue frighten the U.S., but this is a matter that's overlaid with domestic political fights. I could quote lots of things, but I'll just quote Jim Baker in a memo he wrote in 1991, where he describes how we want centralized control of the Soviet nuclear arsenal. We don't want to encourage the republics to become active players in the nuclear issue. Don't undercut the center on this one issue. Don't send the message that we want nuclear pluralism or want the center to disintegrate on the nuclear issue. Weirdly, Soviet nuclear options for the homeland work by virtue of the fear that they might actually disappear entirely. All right, so let me just step back. To summarize, I've shown that U.S. strategy varied in a short period of time. I showed that using archival research, that predation expanded and contracted as Soviet military options waxed and waned, and that leaders in the U.S. thought about security consistent with my argument. Now again, this is only one of the major cases in the book. I also talk about Anglo-American and Anglo-Soviet relations in the early post-war period, and I'm happy to speak to this more in Q&A, but counterintuitively, we now have archival evidence that shows that the Soviet Union tried to bolster the United Kingdom, cooperate with the United Kingdom in the early post-war period solely for the desire of keeping Britain as a potential ally against the United States. And I'd be happy to talk about this more in Q&A. So let me just step back for a second and talk a little bit about the implications of the study. I'm not going to recap too much, but again, my summary takeaway is that rising state strategy depends on how a declining state affects a rising state's security. That rising states, therefore, may want power, but they're cautious in pursuing this. And that alternative accounts, those kind of ad hoc security dilemma, economic interdependence arguments, don't perform as well. Not that they're useless, they don't perform as well. So what are the implications? Well, I think for theory, and grad students might be interested in this, this helps explain linkages between how we get cooperation and competition in international politics, even in a realist, quote unquote, a power and security hungry framework. Okay, for historiography though, I think what this project does is it front loads how the rise and fall of great powers have actually been central to post-World War II diplomatic history in a way that has been underappreciated by much of the existing scholarship. Not all of it, but much of it. But I began with the policy puzzle, so let me end with the policy puzzle. What does this mean for the rise of China? Well, I think the implication is that despite notable concerns that China will be going after the United States, going after the jugular, as we see in the national security strategy released last year or earlier this year, that China is competing intensely with the United States, then my theory actually suggests that China is going to be a cautious riser. It's going to continue, that not only is its current behavior fairly cautious, it will continue being fairly cautious in the future. And above all, the United States, by virtue of having a robust military posture of its own these days, is actually playing a very strong hand and should recognize as such when it thinks about confronting a rising China.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. Do not forget to check out the Texas National Security Review at tnsr.org.